Now I'd like to introduce the second presentation of today. I'd like to invite Ms. Kong Yun Rui, Senior Educational Therapist and Head of the Chinese Program in the Dyslexia Association of Singapore, to present her research on the effectiveness of Chinese intervention program for dyslexic in helping struggling learners, together with Ms. Kaylin Kwan, who is also a Senior Education Therapist. Just a little introduction about the two of them. Ms. Yun Rui is currently pursuing her Masters of Education in the University of Hong Kong. Besides teaching, her scope of work includes research in the area of learning difficulties in Chinese, profiling of students, curriculum development, and mentoring of teachers. Ms. Kaylin is a core team member of the Chinese program in DAS, on top of supporting students in Chinese. So, Kaylin and Yun Rui, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kailin, and this is my colleague Yun Rui. Together we'll be presenting on the effectiveness of a Chinese intervention program for dyslexics and struggling learners. This research is actually conducted by the Chinese team. I'll be covering the first half of the presentation, and Yun Rui will be covering the second half of the presentation. Okay, so as introduced by the MC, we are both educational therapists, and we basically provide intervention to students with dyslexia to learn Chinese. And we do that by equipping them with the skills, namely the language skills of listening, speaking, word recognition, reading compre, and spelling. Okay, so in 2014, there's a research done by Shen et al. And in the research, they found comparing dyslexics and non-dyslexics that students with dyslexia actually have got weaknesses in three main areas. And they are visual orthographic skills, morphological awareness, and visual motor integration skills. So I'll cover the first part. So the first part actually talks about more like the character structure, being able to break apart words and being able to know where the radical, the position is. So for example, in this case, you'll see this first one is Di, which actually means the ground. The second one is Ye, which actually means also. And this last one is Ta, which actually means he. So you'll find that in these three words, in all these three words, this character actually appears in all of them. But what is different is this radical here, which actually represents the ground, and this character here, which actually represents a person. So you actually see students reading, for example, this character as Ta. So these are some of the common mistakes that our students will make. So then we move on to the next one, which is morphological awareness. So morphological awareness basically means, like, for example, in the Chinese language, we have this word called jiu, and basically there are many characters representing jiu. So we could have, for example, the first character, which means wine, the second character, which means the number numeric 9, or the third character, which actually means very long. So the students with dyslexia, basically, they won't know when to use which one, and they generally just use a word which they know to represent the sound jiu. Another part of morphological awareness is actually to do with forming words. And for example, this word that you see, da, this word da actually means big. But when you form words with it, for example, 很大 actually means very big. The next one is 伟大. That actually means very noble. And then the last one is 大象, which actually means totally different. It means elephant. So it's got nothing to do with big in that sense. So, and students may not know that this 大 that appears in each of these words is actually the same 大. Okay, so that's morphological awareness. And the last one is actually visual motor integration skills. So that actually means they're copying, their stroke orders, whether they're copying correctly, the proportion. So for example, in here, you will see that some of the copying mistakes, for example, here, the bottom part is actually quite stuck to the second part of the word. And then here, they are missing a certain stroke. And then this part is actually totally copied wrongly. There's that portion that's copied wrongly. So that's basically most of the weaknesses that can be found in our students with dyslexia. So our Chinese program was actually designed targeting these main areas of weaknesses, and we adopt the OG approach. So the OG approach, basically, as Edmund was mentioning earlier, those are the principles. And Shen et al. Study in 2014 actually found that our intervention program actually benefits students with dyslexia, and mainly in the areas of word recognition, in word form, character recognition, word forming, and spelling. Okay, so some of the features of our intervention, basically we are a small group setting, so we have about 2 to 4 students in a class. It's for 1 hour a week, and it's very targeted to students' needs. So it's based on their ability rather than just the school level that they are in. And a very important part of our class is actually the focus on word recognition, strategies, and reviews. So those are the key main parts of our lessons. Okay, so why the need for this study? So there has not been that much research done on intervention in Chinese, in the Chinese language, while China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, they actually have got research into dyslexia. There's not much done in the area of intervention per se. And also, it's a different context, with Singapore using English as our main language, whereas these other countries, Mandarin or the Chinese dialects are actually their main language. So the language exposure and what they actually need to know is quite different. So you can't exactly directly use their research and apply it to us. Also, Taiwan and Hong Kong actually uses the traditional script. So they would use this, and Singapore actually uses the simplified form. So there's a difference in how it's, the script itself is also different. So we can't exactly use, so we needed to do our own research to make sure that what we have done in our context is really more for our students. Okay. Also, in 2014, Shen et al. Study, there wasn't a control group in their study. So while the research actually found that the students actually made progress in character reading, in word forming, and in spelling, but we couldn't mitigate the effect due to natural growth and schooling. So this is more an extension hoping to see if our program actually benefits our students with dyslexia. Besides that, we actually have got parents calling in, so parents whose children are not dyslexic, but they are actually struggling with the language despite hours of support or tuition that they were getting. So we were wondering if our program actually will be beneficial to these group of students as well. Okay, so what our questions, our research questions, there were 2 main research questions that we wanted to answer. The first being, is our intervention at DAS actually effective for learners with dyslexia? And the second question is, do struggling learners share the same type of learning difficulties as the students with dyslexia? And consequently, does our program then benefit these struggling learners? Okay, so from February to May last year, we actually had recruited participants, and then they were profiled using this battery of Chinese literacy tests to determine the suitability for the program. And also this test will then be used to place them in suitable groups. So there were 2 main groups. So we have the group of Dyslexics, well, basically diagnosed with dyslexia. And the other group is the struggling learners, where despite hours of support, they still are not doing very well, or they're sometimes unable to pass. So they have no known learning difficulty. What they share is they are both from our mainstream schools. Okay, and under the dyslexic group, we now have the control group. Okay, so there's a control group which basically means they are diagnosed as dyslexic, but they do not join our program. There's another group that actually underwent our intervention, and then the struggling learners basically went through our intervention. Okay, so a triangulation of data was actually done to facilitate the validation of data. So it was collected from three perspectives: the parent, the learner, and the therapist. So for the parent, we do have background questions. So for example, we'll be asking like, what's the number of hours of contact with Chinese? Do they get any tuition? So any other forms of support that they get. There's a pre and post survey. So the survey basically is to understand what is their interest level in Chinese, what their reading habits are. So this was done pre and post to measure if there's any change after the intervention. And then post-intervention, we do discuss with parents what progress their children have made and what kind of support they can actually give their children. So for the learners themselves, there is a pre and post survey similar to what the parents also have to fill in. So that's the qualitative part. And then there's a pre and post test which basically measures their character reading. And so that's basically the one that measures if they have really made any progress. And then feedback and observations are actually gathered from the therapist. Okay, so intervention itself. All our struggling learners and the dyslexics have to undergo a minimum 18 weeks of intervention. And it's mostly focused on oracy, which is vocab, sentence structure, and word recognition. So for vocab, we actually is thematic based. So for example, if we teach something related to school, so we're teaching like the places, the names of the schools. And then on sentence structure, so I might be teaching 谁在哪里做什么, which basically means who, where, what. Okay, so for example, a student will say, 我在食堂吃早餐, which actually means I'm eating in the canteen. Okay, translated. So that's the sentence structure. And then for word recognition, so we teach them strategies. And so this one, that's the pictorial. So that's one method of teaching them. So that's the pictorial method of teaching them how to remember words. So that's on word recognition. And the important part is reviews. So for example, this is the semantic radical card deck. So we do this. When we do this, so the student is actually supposed to say what's the name of this radical, what's the meaning, and what's the position. So that's part of the review. Okay, I shall now hand over to Ray, who will share the results of the survey, of the research, sorry.
Okay, so very quickly, just a very quick reminder. So what were the questions that we were trying to answer? The first question that we're trying to find out is whether is the intervention effective for our learners with dyslexia? And the second question is, do learners with dyslexia and struggling learners have similarities? Is there a pattern in their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to learning the Chinese language? And will the intervention that benefits dyslexic also benefit the struggling learners? Okay, so the first question, is the intervention effective? Okay, so as Kylene had shared earlier on, we measured the students on 3 areas. Okay, character recognition, word forming, and spelling. So what the students were asked to do is they were first asked to read the word that they see, okay, and then they were supposed to form a word with that given character. So for example, if you see here, they're supposed to read 我, and then they could form 我们, 我的书包, which means us or my bag. Okay, and then on the spelling task, they were given boxes like this, and then I would give them a word, and then they're supposed to write down the word, the missing character. So I would say 下雨, 下雨, so that they're supposed to write down. So yeah, so this word is not related to the above task, okay, if you're wondering. Yep, so these were the tasks that was performed for us to measure the progress that the kids made over the 18 weeks of intervention, or for those without. All right, so firstly, let's look at the dyslexic and the dyslexic group between the control group and the group on intervention. So what we found, okay, all these are p-values based on t-test. What we see is that for the dyslexic group that underwent intervention, there was the improvement in character recognition, word forming, and spelling were found to be significant, which means that the intervention group were able to read more characters, they were able to form more words, and also spell more characters. Okay, so for those of us who don't really do statistics, the asterisk means the more asterisks, the better. All right, the more significant the result. Okay, so the next question that we are trying to answer is there similarities between the dyslexic and the struggling learners? So we ran a one-way ANOVA, and that showed us that there's no significant difference between the three groups, and in fact, they actually have very similar difficulties in terms of their word recognition ability. Okay, so some common word recognition error that we saw was the visual ones, okay, which means that they could, they had difficulty with distinguishing parts that are very similar looking, or even for the second example here, we see that there's just a difference in one stroke, but then they could get mixed up. Okay, so basically this error occurs because the two words are very similar looking. All right, the second one is phonetic. Okay, so for example, this first word here is sheng. Okay, sheng, which, okay, sorry. Okay, the character here is sheng, so the student could pronounce it as shen. So how do we know that this is actually a mispronunciation? Is because they were also asked to form a word. So this student was able to form xue, shen, and then explain that it's called student. So we know that this kid knows what this character means, but basically it's not able to pronounce it correctly. All right, then the next one, the next mistake is semantic. Okay, this is the Chinese word for animals, 动物. So the target word is 动, but what we found is that some students will actually read it as 物. So semantic errors are basically errors that happens because words are related in meaning, or they often appear together. Okay, so those were the common areas of difficulties and errors that the students had. Okay, so given that they have similarities in their profiles, in their learning strengths and weaknesses, so then the question that follows is whether this intervention is also effective for these struggling learners, these students that are struggling with learning the language. Okay, so based on the results, what we see is that for struggling learners, they also showed significant improvement in their character recognition and word forming, but not so for spelling. So they were able to read more characters, they were able to form words with more characters. So as for spelling, it could be that there could be other sub-skill that is involved in spelling, and we definitely need to look into it in time to come. Okay, so there was also a triangulation of data. So based on the pre and post survey that we did with the students reported that they found that Chinese was easier to learn. Okay, and now they can also use different methods to learn Chinese characters, which is probably why they also found it easier to learn. So as you can see from the screen here, so for example, they could use pictures. For this one is to remember pitiful, or come up with short stories to remember the word shy, which means chou. All right, and generally the students also reported increased confidence in learning the language. What was interesting was that for the group of dyslexic learners that went for intervention, okay, they reported that they were able to remember the characters that they have learned. They find it not as difficult, and they like reading Chinese books more. This could probably contribute to why there was also more significant improvement in their spelling scores. Okay, so this was what the kids were saying. So what were the parents saying? So I think what was a very great encouragement to us is that both group parents were agreed upon these findings, that they found that their children liked Chinese more. Okay, they found that the kids were more confident to speak in the language. They were more motivated to learn their spelling, or they can remember what they have learned, and then to read and write in the language. And I think what was quite amazing was that some kids start to read books, and the therapists also observed that these kids were borrowing books home to study. So I think as a reflection for us as a team is that sometimes it's really finding the right way for the kids to learn, to make that learning more engaging. It's not that the kid cannot learn, but sometimes because of the differences, we just need to find a way to help them to learn. Okay, so in conclusion, I think we found the intervention as effective, although there are differences that we definitely need to look into further in time to come. Okay, I think the limitation we had was that there was no control group for struggling learners. Yeah, so we could not safely mitigate growth due to schooling and also natural growth. Okay, and in this study, our students were between primary 2 to primary 5, primary 2 to primary 6. So these kids were developmentally quite different. So I think if we were to repeat this study, we would try to keep the range smaller and also to increase in the sample size. As with all studies, I think that the more the better to lend greater credibility. Yeah, and then if you have any further questions, you can contact myself and Kylene at these email addresses.
No problem. Okay, thank you so much, Yun Ray and Kylene. Can I please invite our Chief Financial Officer again, Ms. Chai Su Chow, to help give out the tokens of appreciation.
Together.